You stand in the dim chamber of Whitehall Palace on a freezing January morning, 1547. The most feared man in England, Henry VIII, once the radiant Renaissance prince, now lies stretched upon his deathbed. His swollen body trembles beneath layers of velvet and fur, his skin blotched with sores, his breath rattling like a broken bellows. The room reeks of incense and myrrh, but no fragrance can disguise the foul odour that seeps from his diseased flesh. Priests mutter prayers, courtiers keep their distance, and even his closest attendants cannot help but recoil at the sight before them. This is not the noble death of a monarch. This is the slow collapse of a rotting giant. Henry's decline was not just personal, it was political, spiritual, and cosmic. For decades he had ruled as if divinely appointed, the man who shattered England's bond with Rome, who crowned himself head of the church, who sent wives, friends, and rivals to the scaffold with the flick of his hand. To his subjects, Henry's body had been more than human. It was the vessel of authority, the living symbol of God's order. But as the end approached, that sacred vessel was disintegrating before their eyes. His legs oozed with ulcers, his massive girth crushed his own organs, and his face, once admired for its princely vigour, had grown distorted, purpled, grotesque. When he finally died, the horror did not end. His corpse, swollen with gases, began to break down at a shocking pace. Chroniclers describe fluids seeping from his coffin. One story spread like wildfire, that the coffin burst, spilling foul liquid onto the floor, where dogs licked at it greedily. To Tudor minds, this was not merely an accident, it was prophecy fulfilled. Scripture told of the wicked King Ahab, whose blood was licked by dogs as divine punishment. To many, Henry's fate was the same. God himself had judged the tyrant through the corruption of his body. But before legends and sermons took hold, there were doctors, men who had served in silence, dressing his ulcers, draining his wounds, whispering diagnoses behind closed doors. They were the ones forced to confront the terrible truth of the king's body, a flesh prison eaten from within, marked by disease, obesity, and perhaps sins too shameful to speak aloud. To dissect Henry was not simply to open a corpse, it was to expose the secrets of an empire. What they found inside him became both a medical record and a moral reckoning. This is the story of Henry VIII's rotting body. It is not a tale of romance or courtly love, but of gluttony, lust, disease, and divine terror. His body was both battlefield and prophecy, where ambition, indulgence, and fate collided. Tonight, we peel back the silks and velvet shrouds, not to marvel at a king's splendor, but to face the horror of what lay beneath. And as we do, a disturbing question lingers. If the greatest monarch of his age could rot in such a way, what does that reveal about the cost of unchecked power? But the real shock was yet to come. For when Henry's flesh was opened, the truths spilling out were darker than rumour, stranger than scripture, and more grotesque than his enemies could have ever imagined. Henry VIII's body may have collapsed in filth and pain, but it had once been a weapon of power, an instrument of desire, control, and dynastic ambition. For a king, sexuality was never private. It was the beating heart of empire, the engine of alliances, and the measure of divine favour. And Henry wielded his own body like a battlefield, dragging nations and churches into the shadow of his bedchamber. From the beginning, Henry's marriages were not about love. They were about heirs. His first wife, Catherine of Aragon, gave him a daughter but no surviving son. For Henry, this was not mere disappointment. It was humiliation, a challenge to his manhood and to the Tudor claim to the throne. His hunger for a male heir became obsession, transforming the royal bedroom into the most dangerous place in England. Every glance, every kiss, every whispered rumour of fertility could topple kingdoms. Anne Boleyn, clever, ambitious, and seductive, captivated Henry so fully that he risked eternal damnation to possess her. He tore England from Rome, proclaimed himself the head of the church, and unleashed a religious revolution, all so that his desire could be made lawful. Yet when Anne failed to give him the son he craved, desire turned to fury. She was condemned, her body mutilated on the scaffold, her reputation blackened for centuries. Desire in Henry's court was not passion, it was terror. His wives were both queens and prisoners, cherished until they faltered, then discarded as traitors or whores. Catherine Howard, barely a teenager when she entered Henry's bed, was accused of adultery and beheaded. Jane Seymour died giving birth to the fragile son who would inherit Henry's sickly legacy. Desire was supposed to secure stability, but in Henry's hands it bred chaos, blood, and endless suspicion. And yet, as his body began to fail him, the cruel irony became clear. The man who demanded mastery over women's bodies lost control of his own. His swollen frame, his ulcerated legs, and his faltering potency undermined the very image he had built. Rumours whispered through the court that the king could no longer perform, that his lust had been replaced by impotence. To his enemies, it was proof that God had cursed him. To his physicians, it was a dangerous truth to hide at all costs. Still, Henry's obsession with control persisted. He redefined marriage not once but 6 times, rewriting laws, bending scripture, and discarding women as though they were costumes in his royal performance. He made his desire the foundation of an empire, his sexuality the pivot of politics. And in doing so, he revealed a darker truth about power itself, that the body of a king could enslave a nation. But beneath the silks and ceremonies, his flesh was already betraying him. While he feasted, while he hunted, while he raged against wives and ministers, rot was spreading through his veins. The king who claimed mastery over desire was slowly consumed by his own, and the court would soon witness the grotesque price of that hunger, when Henry's body, broken and stinking, became the scandal of his age. The scandal of Henry VIII's body did not begin with his death. It began with a single moment of catastrophe in January 1536. The king, once a towering figure of athletic strength, mounted his horse for a joust. The lists thundered with excitement. Henry had long defined himself by physical prowess, hunting, wrestling, and riding into combat with the ferocity of a warrior. But that day, fate intervened. His horse toppled, crushing his leg beneath its weight. The accident changed everything. His leg never healed properly. What began as bruising became a wound, and what became a wound soon festered into ulcers that would never close. Surgeons drained them with knives, applied poultices of herbs and wine, but nothing stopped the infection. Each day, pus oozed through his bandages, the chamber filled with a smell so pungent that courtiers fainted. Chroniclers whispered that the king's very presence was unbearable. This was more than a medical condition. It was a humiliation. Henry, who had ruled with a princely swagger, was now forced to hobble, lifted into bed by mechanical pulleys. His once muscular legs swelled and cracked. The man who had embodied divine vigor became the subject of disgust. And in the Tudor world, physical decay was not just weakness, it was judgment. Many believed his festering sores were God's punishment for the blood he had spilled and the wives he had betrayed. As the ulcers spread, so did paranoia. Henry lashed out at courtiers and ministers, demanding loyalty with even greater ferocity. He turned against trusted servants, executed allies, and plunged deeper into suspicion. To oppose him was not only treason, it was to risk being accused of mocking the king's decay. Physicians themselves tread a dangerous path. To admit the truth of his failing health could mean disgrace, even death. Yet to deny the reality was to watch silently as the king rotted alive. In private, rumours multiplied. Some whispered that he suffered from syphilis. Others claimed he had been cursed, bewitched, or damned by God. His enemies said the ulcers were the outward sign of a diseased soul, that England itself was infected through him. The human cost was immense. Wives, mistresses, and servants bore the weight of his fury. Anne Boleyn fell not long after the accident, her execution coinciding with the king's deepening infirmity. Catherine Howard's downfall, too, echoed his growing obsession with betrayal. His body's failure magnified his tyranny, as though each ounce of pain demanded new blood to ease it. By the 1540s, the scandal was undeniable. Henry's body had become a grotesque spectacle, his ulcers draining through his royal garments, staining the silks of his throne. Foreign ambassadors reported back to their masters not just of England's politics, but of the stench of its king. And yet the true horror had not yet come. For while his sores disgusted his court, what doctors would later discover within his corpse revealed a far darker picture, one that confirmed the rumours of divine punishment, and cast Henry's reign as a kingdom built upon decay. In Henry VIII's court, politics and the body were inseparable. Every cough, every limp, every rumour of impotence could ripple outward like a dagger thrown into water, cutting alliances, reshaping loyalties, and sparking deadly rivalries. A monarch's strength was supposed to mirror the strength of his kingdom, but as Henry's flesh weakened, his courtiers sharpened their knives. By the 1540s, whispers about the king's health had become weapons. Ambassadors from Spain and France reported that Henry was so heavy and swollen that he could scarcely walk, his temper worsening with each day. His enemies suggested that his impotence proved God's judgment, that his ulcerated body symbolized England's spiritual corruption since breaking with Rome. To spread such ideas was treason, but to believe them was common sense. After all, could a man who could not even control his own body control an empire? Mistresses became part of the game. Though Henry's virility was in question, rumours of secret affairs still circulated. Some said he sought discreet comfort in the arms of courtesans. Others claimed he was incapable, relying instead on physicians' concoctions and aphrodisiacs that only deepened his suffering. Whether true or false, such whispers carried immense political weight. For if the king was impotent, the succession was in jeopardy, and the entire Tudor dynasty trembled. Religion added a dangerous edge. Henry had declared himself head of the Church of England, tearing his country away from centuries of papal authority. To his critics, his decaying flesh was proof of heresy. Catholic propagandists painted his ulcers as divine retribution, a punishment inflicted for casting aside the true faith. Protestant supporters, meanwhile, dared not speak of his condition, spinning the king's suffering into a test of endurance, a tyrant's trial sent by God. Inside the palace, intrigue flourished. Courtiers jostled for influence, using Henry's failing health as an opening. Physicians who tended his ulcers became confidants, their reports and silences shaping policy. Wives and would-be brides navigated a nightmare. To please the king was to risk being consumed by his paranoia. To displease him was to invite the axe. Even his final queen, Catherine Parr, balanced carefully between loyalty and survival, soothing the sickly monarch while quietly preparing for her own escape should he turn against her. Every scandal, every betrayal, every execution was magnified by the shadow of the king's body. The Anne Boleyn affair, the downfall of Cromwell, the swift rise and fall of Catherine Howard, each was fueled in part by Henry's anxieties about masculinity, succession, and control. His personal rot became a national obsession, his private weakness a matter of state security. And yet, for all the secrecy, the truth could not be hidden forever. For when the king finally died, his body revealed in death what many had whispered in life. That beneath the silks, beneath the crowns, beneath the prayers of priests, the great monarch was nothing more than a rotting man, consumed by his own flesh. Henry VIII's body did not only belong to him, it belonged to England. His subjects, from the highest bishop to the lowest farmer, looked upon their king as a vessel of divine order. And when that vessel began to rot, everyone saw it, and everyone gave it meaning. Among commoners, the king's ulcers and swelling became the stuff of rumour and superstition. Word spread through taverns and marketplaces that the king's stench carried across rooms, that attendants fainted in his presence, that his very flesh was cursed. In an age where sickness was seen not only as medical but spiritual, Henry's decay was read as divine punishment. To peasants, his open sores were proof that God himself judged the tyrant who had broken with Rome and executed queens like cattle. For priests and clergy, the king's body was theological dynamite. Catholic exiles wrote of Henry's ulcers as the physical rot of a heretic, proof that God had cursed England for abandoning the Pope. Protestant preachers spun the opposite. They claimed Henry's suffering showed him as a biblical Job, enduring trials for a higher cause. In both narratives, his body became scripture written in flesh. In daily life, the contrast was impossible to ignore. While Henry feasted on swan, venison, and sugared confections, his subjects scraped for bread. While he demanded silks and perfumes to mask his odour, ordinary villagers died of the same afflictions in silence, buried quickly in shallow graves. The double standard was grotesque. His own wives were blamed, shamed, or executed for infertility. Yet his impotence and disease were shielded from criticism, hidden behind walls of fear. Gender roles magnified the hypocrisy. Women were reduced to vessels for heirs, their worth measured by wombs and obedience. Men of lower birth could be flogged or shunned for disease, but a king could rot in full view of Europe and still be treated as God's anointed. His flesh was not condemned. It was rationalized, spiritualized, or silenced, depending on who told the tale. Yet whispers cut through the fear. Servants and attendants, the ones forced to scrub the pus from his sheets, carried stories beyond the palace. They told of bandages soaked in corruption, of chamber pots filled with foul discharge, of the impossible task of hiding the truth from foreign ambassadors. These stories became folk legends, dark tales told in hushed voices at night, reminders that even the mightiest king could not escape the grave's stink. And still, the spectacle fascinated. In Tudor England, death was public theatre. The sick rooms of kings became stages where courtiers measured loyalty and enemies prayed for downfall. As Henry's body collapsed, it became both horror and entertainment, part tragedy, part prophecy. But the fascination turned to terror when death finally arrived. For the bloated corpse of the king would not rest quietly. Instead, it erupted in a spectacle so grotesque that even loyalists saw it as a sign of God's wrath. January 1547. The long reign of Henry VIII ended not in triumph, but in stench. For weeks he had been bedridden, his legs swollen and ulcerated, his body so heavy that servants used pulleys to shift him from bed to chair. He could no longer hunt, no longer ride, no longer even climb a staircase. The once proud warrior king, who had dazzled Europe with his athleticism, was reduced to a bloated figure gasping for breath, drowning slowly inside his own flesh. As death drew close, priests were summoned to perform the last rites. Yet Henry, fearful of damnation, wavered. He had broken with Rome, executed holy men, dissolved monasteries, and declared himself God's chosen. Now, facing eternity, he asked for confession, but did not live long enough to receive it. Some chroniclers claim he whispered, "All is lost," as the shadows closed around him. Others say he died defiantly, clutching his crown until his fingers stiffened in rigor mortis. Whatever the truth, on January 28th, Henry VIII was gone. But death was not an escape. It was the beginning of scandal. His enormous body, already filled with infection and gas, began to decompose at a shocking pace. Courtiers tried to mask the odor with herbs and perfumes, but the stench seeped through walls, filling the palace with a smell described as loathsome and unendurable. And then came the moment that etched itself into legend. As his coffin was carried to Windsor, witnesses reported a horrifying event. The bloated corpse swelled until the casket split, releasing a torrent of putrid fluid. Chroniclers wrote that the liquid seeped onto the floor and dogs crept in to lap it up. To many this was no accident. It was divine justice. The Bible told of King Ahab, cursed for his sins, whose blood was licked by dogs after death. Henry's fate, it seemed, was the same. Whether fact or rumour, the story spread like wildfire. Protestants spun it as a parable of human weakness. Even the greatest king is but dust. Catholics seized it as proof that God had punished the heretic who defied Rome. To the common people, it was confirmation of what they already whispered, that Henry VIII had been cursed in life and condemned in death. Inside the coffin, the horror was worse. Accounts suggest his flesh was blackened and bloated, his wounds festering even in death. Physicians, forced to examine the remains, recorded extreme obesity, infected ulcers, and a body so swollen that the skin cracked open. Some whispered of gangrene, others dared to suggest venereal disease, but few put their names to paper. Writing too much truth about a king's corpse could still cost a man his life. This was the turning point. The Golden Prince, the man who broke England from Rome, who built palaces and executed queens, ended not in majesty, but in mockery. His body, once paraded as a symbol of divine strength, had become a grotesque warning. But the most terrifying revelations were still to come, for the physicians who looked inside his corpse saw not just death, but the price of unchecked indulgence, and the legacy of a king whose body had become his last confession. But the consequences stretched far beyond medicine. Henry's heirs inherited not only his throne but his shadow. His sickly son, Edward VI, reigned for just 6 years before dying young. His daughter Mary burned Protestants in a desperate bid to restore Catholicism, her zeal fueled in part by the trauma of her mother's disgrace. And Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, would rule with caution, forever aware of the blood-soaked precedent set by her father. The instability of the Tudor succession mirrored the instability of Henry's body. A dynasty born in ambition was crippled by disease. Religious conflict found in Henry's corpse a perfect metaphor. To Protestants, the rotting king proved that flesh is mortal and that even monarchs cannot escape decay. To Catholics, it was a warning from God. A heretic had been struck down and shamed for his crimes against the true church. Pamphlets and sermons echoed the legend of the bursting coffin, turning a medical accident into theological propaganda. His body was no longer his own. It had become a weapon in the battle for England's soul. Even beyond England, foreign courts watched with fascination and disgust. The French mocked the fat tyrant who had once sought glory in their tournaments. The Spanish whispered that his rotting body was the price for casting aside Catherine of Aragon, their beloved princess. Across Europe, Henry's death was seen less as the passing of a king, and more as the collapse of a monstrous ego consumed by its own flesh. And yet, centuries later, Henry's body still grips our imagination. Archaeologists, physicians, and historians debate the precise nature of his illnesses. Was it untreated diabetes, a metabolic disorder, or was it, as his contemporaries believed, the wrath of God? The unanswered questions keep the legend alive, turning his corpse into a puzzle of flesh, faith, and fear. The consequences of Henry's rot were not confined to the 16th century. His body became a symbol of absolute power undone by its own excess. A reminder that no empire, no dynasty, no king can escape the judgment written in flesh. But the final lesson lay not in medicine or politics, but in philosophy. Henry VIII's corpse was a mirror, reflecting the darkest truth of power, that even the mightiest throne cannot protect against the corruption of the grave. The story of Henry VIII's body is not only a Tudor scandal, it is a parable about power, indulgence, and mortality. For here was a king who believed himself chosen by God, a monarch who rewrote laws, redefined religion, and commanded the deaths of queens, ministers, and martyrs. Yet in the end, no decree could silence the truth of his flesh. His body became his undoing. The Golden Prince of England, once admired for his athletic strength and princely charm, was remembered instead for a swollen carcass that split its coffin. The man who demanded control over wives, churches, and kingdoms could not control the corruption eating through his veins. His last testament was not a speech, nor a law, nor a monument. It was his own decay, spilling across the floor for all to see. This grotesque finale resonated far beyond Tudor England. It became a weapon for theologians, a warning for rulers, and a fascination for commoners. For centuries, his corpse was invoked as evidence of divine punishment, of tyranny punished by rot. Even today, historians cannot resist probing his ailments, asking whether his madness, paranoia, and cruelty were symptoms of disease. Was his tyranny written in his blood? Did his medical suffering fuel the executions that scarred his reign? Modern parallels are impossible to ignore. We still obsess over the health of rulers, from leaked medical reports to whispered rumors of sickness in palaces and parliaments. A faltering hand, a stumble, a hidden diagnosis. These small signs become public obsessions, as if the body of the powerful contains secrets about the fate of nations. Henry VIII's rot was not unique to his age. It is part of a pattern. When leaders claim divinity, their mortal decay becomes the most powerful reminder of their humanity. And perhaps this is why Henry VIII continues to haunt us. His story forces us to confront the fragility of power. We are taught to see kings and emperors as immortal symbols. But beneath the silks and crowns lie bones, blood, and weakness. If even the most ruthless monarch of his age could be reduced to a stinking coffin, what does that say about the rest of us? The unanswered mysteries linger. Did Henry truly suffer from syphilis, or was that slander spread by his enemies? Was his decline the result of diabetes, Cushing's syndrome, or the legacy of a single fateful joust? Or was it something simpler, the inevitable consequence of gluttony, pride, and unchecked indulgence? The silence of the physicians and the decay of his body mean we will never know for certain. But perhaps the truth does not lie in diagnosis. It lies in the lesson. Henry's rotting corpse was his final confession, a testament carved in flesh. A king who broke his world apart to satisfy desire, left behind not glory, but stench. His power ended as all power does, not with eternity, but with a body that could not escape the grave. And so we are left with the question, if the secrets of a king were revealed only in death, what secrets of today's rulers still lie hidden beneath silks and crowns, waiting for their bodies to betray them?